Good morning, everybody. We're very pleased to see you again for the second day of Le Rendez-vous Paris Mat. And we're going to begin the second day, as is customary, by talking about figures for the market. Hello, Mathieu Daubin, your president of COMAT, Chief Underwriting Officer, EMEA Marine, AXA Insurance. Of course, there was the pandemic, quite a shock for the air industry. In maritime affairs, likewise, there was a huge impact. All these figures can be downloaded on the chat, and you can have the figures before your eyes in the course of the presentation. What do these figures show us this year? What lessons do you draw? Good morning, everybody, and I'm very pleased to see you at the Rendez-vous Paris Mat. As usual, I'm going to give you the insurance, maritime transport, shipping, etc. figures. As we saw, insurance, transport insurance as a whole is the first thing I'll talk about. In 2020, the French market changed with the transfer of a major player into another country. He moved from France to another country. And for the very first time, we noted a significant drop in our turnover, minus 14%. This is international affairs in the foreign branches for the player, which now are consolidated in a different country. That's what accounts for the change. So transport insurance as a whole, as you can see in this slide, direct business, acceptances France and outside France, for 2020 is consolidated at 1.8 billion euros as against 2.38 billion euros in 2019. That's an 18% drop. You might recall that this change mainly impacts the activity outside France on a like-for-like basis. Trends for goods transported are 2% instead of minus 30% as presented in the slide. For Hull, minus 2% as opposed to minus 7%. And for transport insurance as a whole, including aviation, minus 2% instead of the minus 18%. I'd also like to specify that these consolidated figures are not sufficiently representative of the diversity of the portfolio, and in particular major risks, which we kept in 2020, as in 2019. There were major price hikes between 10 and 15%. And these rate increases were offset by a drop in volume and value transported, mainly linked to COVID-19. Also, with the loss of some business on the French market for the benefit of other markets, the London or Benelux markets, or even Switzerland. Now, if we look at the breakdown in the subscriptions for 2021, 1.9 billion euros, traditionally, we can see goods transported 36%, 37% for maritime hull, 23% aviation, and 4% for air and space. And what about maritime insurance in particular? These figures show a major drop in world trade, but you have a more nuanced assessment of the situation. Yes, it's more nuanced. The macroeconomic environment, of course, in 2020 was very exceptional. And this slide and these curves illustrate this quite ably. One can not only see a collapse in global GDP, but also in world trade, to which one must add the currency exchange effect, which impacted negatively maritime insurance because premiums are mainly in dollars, whereas we consolidate here in euros. Now, in terms of the global market, a more positive point, we have noted a growth in maritime insurance underwritten in France, which illustrates the attractiveness of our market. This slide shows figures for 2019 because we cannot yet collate the 2020 figures. But for French maritime hull and cargo business $28.7 billion is the total estimate. That's a market share of 6. And as you can see, this market share has grown because in 2017 we stood at just under 5%. And given the attractiveness of the market and Parimat initiatives, there has been a growth of 1 point. According to IOMI, which is the International Union of Marine Insurance, world turnover for marine insurance is $28.7 billion. 57%, as you can see, cargo, 24% hull, 6% marine liability, and the other remainder is offshore and energy. Now, what are the trends when it comes to business underwritten in France only in 2020? One can note an increase of 2% in the sums underwritten in France. And here we can nuance the situation. It's hard to really see the detail, but you have hull. Hull insurance grew by 15%. And we believe that this increase of premiums and hull insurance is basically linked to an increase in rates. However, as you can see on the second line, goods transported experienced a drop of 6%. Don't draw the conclusion that there were drops in rates. In fact, it's a mixed bag. There were increases in rates for goods transported in certain segments, but these rates increases were offset by some loss in volume transported due to COVID-19 and also the loss of some business, significant business, as I was saying earlier on. I'm sorry we don't have sufficient granularity to break down the various segments of goods transported. Now, if we look at the technical results, this slide provides a wealth of information. It's interesting to look at the technical results in the hull branch just for direct business in France. That's 370 million euros in direct business, no reinsurance. And what can one note above all? Look at this triangle on the left of the slide. You can see, unfortunately, that there is a downward trend between 2016 and 2019. During the financial years, the most recent financial years, 84%, 97%, 87%, 69%. There one must add on average 33%, which is distribution costs and general overheads for companies. And when you add these ratios, claims over premiums and overheads, there the ratios are above 100%. And that shows that, unfortunately, the hull segment in France still remains insufficiently profitable. Unfortunately, the 2020 financial year holds out further deficits, 15% increase in rates probably, but you can see that for 2020 we have 71%. Of course, there were some exceptional events when it came to the French market, but here again, premiums are not sufficient. As you can see, the frequency of claims and major claims. It's important to underscore this because basically together we have to provide for a given balance on the market and we have to ensure the market remains lively. Global results, there's a little graph on the lower left. It's very small, but it is an image from IOMI, and it shows the profitability of the global hull sector. In 2019, you can see the profitability of hull, and it's slightly more profitable in the world than in France. Now, when it comes to goods transported, that is goods, cargo, business underwritten in France, direct business without reinsurance. The turnover is 600 million euros, and we can see that in the triangle, the segment is quite profitable. Look at the financial years, 57%, 61%, 70%, 45%. If you add the famous 33%, we're under 100%. One might think that trends on the market are pretty profitable and guarantee a lively future. But you have to nuance the situation once again, because turnover, 600 million euros, is not necessarily all that representative of goods transported. This segment is very heterogeneous. As you know, there are industrial customers, business customers. Also, segments are divided into corporate, SMEs, and some segments are more profitable than others. Having said this, in terms of aviation transport and goods, we don't have sufficient granularity for this segment. We just look at transported goods here, and overall, this is profitable. Whereas Yaomi, on the lower left of the slide, shows that the segment racked up a deficit for 5 consecutive years, and we're beginning to strike a bit of a balance thanks to increases in rates which took place over the last 3 years. That is for marine insurance. Thank you very much for these comments. These nuances were important too. The slides contain a wealth of information, and you can download them in the chat if you need, and if you want to note down some of the details. Now let's go to aviation. It was an unprecedented shock. What is the state of affairs in this area? Well, it was an unprecedented shock indeed. The market of aviation insurance comprises 3 segments. You have the airlines, the manufacturers, and general aviation. If you look at the global market for airlines, this slide illustrates the situation well. It was presented by a partner of Comat. We expected to see major increases in rates in this segment, which wasn't very profitable. We thought that 2.3 billion euros would be cashed in. You can see this in the upper curve. As you can see, with the sudden practical halt in airline activity, the total number of flights dropped by about 55% just in 2020. The post-COVID premium is $1.8 billion, and it's a mix. There were increases in rates, drop of 53%. You can calculate things, no, but it was not that calculation. There was a drop in activity and an increase in rates. The global market for airline companies is about $1.8 billion. Now, what about the other segments? Construction and aviation in general, there's not much of a COVID effect. You can see that there have been increases and the market is growing. The market stands at 1.08 for construction and 2.4 for general aviation. Now, if you look more at the French market, once again, one has to recall the specificities of this year, 2020, and which is continuing in 2021. Unfortunately, the number of flights dropped and air traffic, well, it was the very worst year in history. There was a 66% drop in passengers, 11% in freight. So volumes have collapsed. When it comes to airline safety, it was a sort of a so-so year. According to the IATA index, the number of accidents per million flights increased slightly compared with the average over the last 4 years, 1.11, whereas the average was 1.41. And you have to add a few fatal accidents which hit the industry. For France, when you look at figures for France, just for direct business, in aviation it's direct business and acceptances in France, what can one observe? There has been a drop of minus 10%, for aviation as a whole, 441 million euros as opposed to 491 in 2019. And this difference in premiums at a constant exchange rate, because things are quoted in dollars and collated in euros, that's a drop of 39%. And this drop is very representative of the world market. I beg your pardon, it's -3% at a constant exchange rate. Now, when it comes to the airlines, here again, I've distinguished between the three segments. You have airline companies, a drop of 21% or 14% at a constant exchange rate. Once again, it's the same as elsewhere in the world, drop in traffic, drop in volume, but offset by increases in rates. And for manufacturers, at the bottom of the table, for manufacturers, the turnover is 110 million euros, consolidated in France, 77.3 billion euros, general aviation and miscellaneous. It's hard to compare with the global market because the market is small compared with marine insurance. There are different policies and strategies depending on the airline company or the market. In particular, when it comes to the construction segment, depending on the impact of the grounding of the Boeing aircraft, which strongly affected the manufacturing market. So that's what I wanted to say about the aviation market. And now let's go on to air and space. What were the highlights in this area in 2020? Well, the space market is part and parcel of Paris-Mat in the aviation segment. For France, this represents 66 million euros. We have noted that the market was far more resilient than the marine and aviation markets, more resilient in the face of the COVID-19 crisis because the market was able to redress rates in a major way, and there was activity and campaigns which continued as programmed. What we can note compared with the previous financial year is the following. Of course, some launches were delayed, and the effect of these increases will probably be felt more in 21-22. So we'll meet again next year to see whether this is borne out in terms of volume and pricing on the space market. Thank you very much. Thank you for compiling all this data. Perhaps to conclude, we have a question which has been sent in. A hull underwriting is negative in France but positive elsewhere. Why did this situation arise? Don't you think that premiums are low in France? Well, the first thing is the size of the market, because we pool things, of course. If you look at the technical results, we're talking about premiums worth 370 million euros, and that is just business underwritten in France, outside reinsurance. I think, in fact, that the French market in 2020 had more of a deficit than other markets. It was unfortunate. There were two major events. I won't mention them, but I'm sure all the underwriters know them well. There were two very important events which were very strange and odd, which destroyed the profitability on the market. We usually have to look at the market net of reinsurance, which is usually profitable. I think that increases in rates on the hull market are homogeneous, fit in with those on the global market. The hull market is similar in France as to elsewhere. Sometimes performance is even better. So we'll have to wait and see next year. Watch the triangle carefully. It's a good exercise which is done by the FFA, and it enables one to see trends in claims, in premiums, in rates on the French market and compared with the international market. Okay, well then I think that will be the conclusion of this discussion on figures on the market. We are here at the Maison de la Chimie. The public is following at a distance, but don't hesitate to participate in the chat and ask your questions. We'll meet again in 5 minutes' time after a break for our partners.